So look, I'm going to talk a bit about Spartacus, and I'm going to start off with a mass crucifixion. So in 73 BC, 6,000 prisoners were marched up the Appian Way between Capua and Rome, and were basically crucified in sort of over sort of regular sort of distances all the way through. And that's a massive investment, even for Rome. And today I want to look at why they did this and what was the significance of it. Now, and it was done by this man, Marcus Crassus, of course, sort of famous for being the great Republican triumvirate. Well, the first thing is they're incredibly successful, this group. They'd beaten 5 Roman armies. They'd created, over 3 years, and they had created enormous economic damage. So archaeologists, even now, when they look in central and southern Italy, there were some areas where this group went through which never really recovered economically, or sometimes not for decades, some of them for centuries. So there was that. There was their success. But also, it was who they were. Because, of course, this was a slave army. These were non-people, non-humans, basically, led by Spartacus. And Spartacus, in 71, who was a Thracian, had escaped from a gladiatorial school in Capua with just 70-odd companions and fled to Vesuvius, Mount Vesuvius, where they had taken up residence. And then over a period of time, over 3-4 years, the 3 years, they crisscrossed across Italy, winning lots of victories. And eventually, this army developed into about 120,000 slaves. And they almost marched on Rome, almost won more victories. But eventually, a bit like they did with Hannibal, the Romans managed to blockade this Spartacus down in the toe of Italy, in Calabria. And eventually, 73, the great battle happens, and he is defeated and killed. And then the remainder of these slaves are taken up to the Appian Way and meet this rather horrific death. The thing about Spartacus, of course, is everyone knows about him because he's the sort of great post-Enlightenment or Enlightenment freedom fighter and hero. And you take your pick from sort of revolutionary France onwards. I mean, Saurin's novels, obviously a little bit before, but it became very, very popular in revolutionary France and in post-revolutionary France too. And you could take any number of others. You could look at Garibaldi, 1874, again, the great Italian novel that comes out, which again equates Garibaldi with Spartacus as this great freedom fighter. You could think about the great slave liberator of Haiti, Louverture as well, of course, who was known as Black Spartacus. And then we can move into the 20th century. Karl Marx basically considered that Spartacus was the great proletarian freedom fighter par excellence of the ancient world, and he thought actually, perhaps, of all time. And then, of course, have Rosa Luxemburg and the Spartacus League, which we obviously all know about. And Che Guevara, he also self-styled as Spartacus as well. And even Ronald Reagan, who I don't know whether he got a bit confused, but he saw basically Spartacus as a great libertarian, okay, as a person breaking the shackles of the state. Now, we can kind of move on to Hollywood here. And of course, great Hollywood depictions. How many of you seen Stanley Kubrick's Spartacus? A film more talked about than watched. And when I watched it, you realize how disappointing it is. Basically, good old Kirk here, they escape from Capua, they end up in Vesuvius, which turns into kind of like a sort of holiday camp for slaves. And literally nothing happens, so it's basically stripped of all of the gore, all the vengeance, all the anger, and all the blood. And it turns into a kind of saccharine kind of love story, but also a sort of trite kind of parable on camaraderie. Think about, I am Spartacus. And then, of course, there's a sort of martyrdom where they all march down. This is the one battle where, of course, they're going to lose. And so, under Kubrick, sort of Spartacus becomes a rebel without a cause. It's very difficult to work out quite what he's doing there. And then lastly, you have the Spartacus of the sort of television thing, which is actually quite good, but it more than makes up for all of the lack of sex, violence, and blood and gore. It's quite something. You can see why it was eventually cancelled. And you have to wonder, what in our sort of fragile times, You have to wonder about, and I think about my university and etc. You know, who would Spartacus be fighting for now? Probably a whole litany of different kinds of causes. So anyway, look, that's our sort of the modern rendering of Spartacus. But what I want to talk about really is about Roman attitudes towards Spartacus, which are actually kind of more interesting in a way. Again, you get all the things of vilification, unease, and pregnant silence. And in many respects, it's very, very similar. What he says about Spartacus is very similar to what they say about Hannibal. He really is the sort of bogeyman, okay? And he gets praised for being a hero, for being a great general, etc., but also sort of condemned for barbarity, impiety, and cruelty. And he sort of lasts as this sort of this figure. And you think about the poet Horace writing about during the civil wars, and he writes about, well, you know, Rome's destroying itself now in the civil wars. You know, we resisted Spartacus, the violent hordes of Spartacus, but you know, now we're destroying ourselves. And then later on, he kind of moves on to talking about Campanian wine, and wondering whether there's any vintages left from the 70s, if Spartacus and his hordes have sort of glugged it all down or done whatever. So in other words, we can see he's this sort of very important figure. And I want to think about why there's this unease. And I'm going to say it's for three reasons. And one, and they're all connected in some respects to empire and imperialism and the sort of growth of empire. And the first one is really around the economics of conquest for Rome. And, you know, if you think about it, you know, and there's a sort of, one of the things which Appian talks about, and I know Keith Hopkins was another sort of, who was a big figure in my academic development, also sort of argued this. There's an interesting thing. If you think about the Roman Empire, especially in the second and first centuries, there's an enormous number of wars of conquest, and what comes with it are huge numbers of captives. First Punic War, I think they have 75,000 captives, and they all become slaves. And the sort of argument goes that before that, Rome, of course, has a sort of citizen peasant army who go off, but sometimes 10, 20 years, etc. And what happens is that especially in Italy, in central and southern Italy, and also in Sicily, senators and others start to sort of buy up the small peasant farms, and we get the creation of what we call the latifundia. And these are massive, massive estates. You know, and we tend to think, I mean, I'm excavating a villa, or soon to be excavating a villa with Axon Johnson Foundation. And this is something completely different. The sorts of villas I'm talking about are industrial, agricultural complexes with no fine buildings, etc. These are places where thousands, sometimes, of slaves are in barracks, working in chain gangs, and basically creating this, you know, basically it's a huge, huge thing you find right across these areas, okay? Huge change in land holdings and in terms of the economy. And of course, what happens to all of these peasant farmers? Well, the story goes, of course, they end up being the urban poor. And of course, that's how you create your sort of market. So, in other words, there's a huge kind of economic prerogative. These people that Spartacus, these aren't, you know, Spartacus might be a gladiator. Most of these people that join him these are people that are escaping out of this particular system, which is a huge problem. So that's the first thing. Second thing is this, is that you can talk about it in terms of the sort of ambiguities and the unease and the inconsistencies in the way that Romans think about slavery and also and freedom. But in some respects, I could argue that it sort of comes from a sort of legal definition, and then they try and backfill it to some extent with sort of philosophical kind of explanations for it. Because, of course, remember, a slave's a piece of livestock. They're not human. But if you think about the sort of Roman imperial system and why it's so successful, it's because it's a fantastic franchising act. I mean, that's what really, and it's got great military power, but it's a franchising act. With the Romans, you can always become. You can become a Roman. If you're a barbarian, you can become free. Okay? There's always this sort of sliding scale. You know, in this humanitas, it's basically the sort of idea that you can become human. And that in itself sort of creates sort of a series of sort of inconsistencies, which I think create a sort of create an issue. And you can think about it in terms of, I mean, I'm going to give you an example here. You know, manumission, so slaves become free. And in some respects, you know, it's a sort of Darwinian thing, where basically it's slaves who have skills, who are successful, and also have proximity towards their masters. So these tend to be a particular group. But in some respects, when they become free, that's the sort of the great sort of forcing ground, the socio-economic forcing ground that sort of pushes people up through society. So that in itself sort of creates a sort of a sense of uneasy. Are you human or are you not? And Seneca, for instance, so Seneca argues, Seneca says, be kind to your slaves, because basically they breathe like you, they are humans. So there's always this sort of slight tension between those particular two things. And I think, here we have this man, Publius Satyr, and we can see slave auctioneer. Here he is, there's a poor slave in the middle, and they're auctioning the slave. He was a slave himself, so basically he's a freed slave. So in other words, you can see the sort of issues with this, of this system and the way it works. And if you think about in the Roman world, and you think about what is considered to be monstrous, it's always something which is touched by humanity. There's a sense, I was thinking about this the other day in terms of, there's a plague of feral pigs in Australia at the moment, okay? They're obsessed with feral pigs, they're everywhere, okay? And the thing about them is they've become monstrous, they've become huge, they've become things we're really frightened of, because these are sort of domesticated pigs that have escaped back into it. They're sort of touched by humanity, and to us, that makes them repulsive. And I would argue that in some respects, this is the position that you find. In some respects, the sort of intellectual position around slaves and who they are. But at the same time, of course, you have to think about it this way. Even kind masters, even those that basically are sort of, looking after their slaves, Pliny and others that pat themselves on the back, it's about productivity. You get better productivity out of your slaves, okay, if you look after them properly. They're like livestock. And Seneca, of course, Seneca's position, Seneca, the slave owner, his is a philosophical position, okay? He's there as the philosopher more than anything else. But there's always that, what's he say? So many slaves, so many enemies, okay? And so there's always that sense of basically of the fact that they could turn on you. And Pedanius Secundus, who was the city prefect, he was murdered by, so your slaves the slaves that tended to murder you, were the ones obviously the closest to you, the same way as you're more likely to be murdered by a member of your family. And Secundus, one of his slaves, kills him. So all 400 of his household slaves, sort of women, children, etc., are marched through the city, and then they're all strangled publicly, okay, to make sure these things don't happen. So there's this sort of sense of unease. And the last thing, there's a sort of unease around... I'll come back to them. The other unease is around their own lack of freedom. It takes Epictetus, an ex-slave, Stoic, to lecture Roman senators about how to live in a period of autocracy when he had no freedom. But basically where you were, you were in a life and death situation with emperors. So in other words, those are the sort of three main things. But what about Spartacus himself? Well, how do we know? Okay, Spartacus in the end just wanted to be free himself. Okay, he probably wanted to go out and sort of get some booty, get some commit some sort of acts of vengeance. Okay, but that's not his power. His power, and I just want to quickly say this about a literary spat between Arthur Koestler and George Orwell. So Koestler's Gladiators, okay, one of the things which, one of the things is that this is about a sort of a utopia. And he argues that in Gladiators, that he sets up this place called Sun City. It's a utopia. But his fatal flaw is that he says that basically Orwell argues that Koestler gets stuck between two different things, okay? He gets stuck between Spartacus as an allegory and him as a fact, okay? He says in the end, what you end up with is him just being a sort of tin pot proletarian 20th century dictator wearing a tunic. He doesn't manage to sort of pick out who he is. He's sort of lost in this thing. But in some respects, that's absolutely perfect. I think Orwell basically gets this wrong and Koestler gets this right, because Koestler's portrayal of Spartacus is basically right. It's an empty void, like the upper slopes of Vesuvius, where he and his supporters basically first took refuge. He's so difficult to pin down. He's as difficult to pin down as the many conflicting forms of liberty for whom he has been claimed as champion. Thank you.
So we don't know if Spartacus expressed any views on liberty and freedom.
He enslaved Romans. Okay, so in other words, there's not the idea of slavery. He wasn't a sort of pushing back at the idea against slavery. Slavery was a norm. It was the fact. I mean, even Augustine basically saves a whole shipload of people being taken off to slavery. But that was because they'd been free before, and they were Christians. Okay, it wasn't. It's not a question of, you know. It was a sort of, yes. So with Spartacus.
But as you mentioned, this is the third slave uprising.
Yeah.
Did the Romans behave as harshly the first two times?
They always behaved harshly, but this was a much more. This was a very dramatic moment. You know, crucifying them in that way, and crucifying is a bad way to go.
Yeah. What if? What if the march to Rome had been successful?
Who knows? That's a big question.